In the world of geopolitics, some deals redraw the map, and others, well, others just expose the hidden fault lines of power that were there all along. Today, we're diving deep into one of those deals, a pact that promised to completely reshape the Horn of Africa, but instead, it tells a fascinating story of ambition, of failure, and of the very nature of what it even means to be a country. So let's set the scene. It's January 2024. A Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, is suddenly announced between Ethiopia and the self-declared state of Somaliland. Now, on paper, it looked like a simple port deal, but in reality, this was a political earthquake, a huge gamble designed to fundamentally shake up the strategic balance in one of the world's most vital regions. Okay, to get this, you really have to understand the two main players. On one side, you've got Ethiopia. We're talking a regional giant. Over 120 million people that's been haunted for 3 long decades by the fact that it has no coastline. Then you have Somaliland, a state that's been acting independently for just as long, building democratic institutions, all in the hope of getting one thing: international recognition. This deal was the moment where those two 30-year quests finally crashed into each other. I mean, it had all the ingredients of a historic breakthrough, right? A true game changer. So that brings us to the central question we have to ask. Why did it fall apart so quickly and so spectacularly? The answer, it turns out, reveals a lot more than just a diplomatic blunder. It tells us something profound about power in the 21st century. To really unpack this, we're leaning on the fantastic analysis of 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐨 𝐻𝐈. He makes a really compelling case that the deal didn't fail because the idea itself was bad. No, it failed, and I'm quoting him here, because of Addis Abeba's catastrophic inability to execute its own strategic vision. So think about that. This wasn't a failure of imagination. It was a total failure of execution. So to really get why this one moment was such a big deal, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to understand the powerful historical forces, these deep currents that were pushing both Ethiopia and Somaliland toward this incredibly risky but also potentially revolutionary agreement. For Ethiopia, this whole story is really about a 30-year obsession. Back in 1993, when Eritrea gained independence, Ethiopia lost its entire coastline. Just poof, gone overnight. This created what experts call the Djibouti dilemma, a really dangerous situation where 95% of your entire country's trade is flowing through one single port in another country. For decades, fixing this vulnerability has been the #1 goal of Ethiopian foreign policy, and this Somaliland deal, it was their most daring move yet to solve it. Now let's flip over to Somaliland's story. It's just as compelling. After a really rough union with Somalia, it declared its independence again in 1991. And while most of the world wasn't paying attention, Somaliland did something pretty incredible. It built a stable, working, democratic state pretty much from scratch. But for more than 30 years, it's been missing the one thing it wants most: formal international recognition. This MOU with Ethiopia looked like its golden ticket, a backdoor to finally getting that legitimacy. So you have these two massive, decades-long ambitions colliding in one single agreement. But, as we're about to see, Ethiopia's grand vision for itself completely fell apart the second it hit the harsh light of day, the reality of diplomacy and politics. Let's break down exactly how this whole thing unraveled. You see, this deal was the key part of what Ethiopia called its two-water policy. And this wasn't just about getting another port. No. The goal was way, way bigger. It was about securing access to both the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, basically transforming Ethiopia from this constrained, landlocked country into a real maritime power that could project influence over global shipping lanes. But the collapse? It was fast. It basically happened in 3 acts. Act 1, the big announcement. Act 2, a totally predictable but fierce diplomatic backlash. Somalia called it an act of aggression, the African Union and the Arab League started applying major pressure. And then Act 3, the strategic retreat. Ethiopia started to backpedal, trying to downplay the whole recognition part of the deal, which, of course, was the entire heart of the agreement. And this, right here, is the core of 𝐭𝐡𝐢𝐨 𝐻𝐈 analysis. The whole mess just exposed these deep cracks in Ethiopia's statecraft. You had this huge gap between their vision and their ability to actually do it. You saw their influence inside institutions like the African Union was weaker than they thought. And you saw an inability to stick to their promises when things got tough. But maybe the biggest failure of all was just not planning for a reaction that pretty much everyone else saw coming a mile away. Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. Ethiopia's retreat didn't just put things back to the way they were. It did the exact opposite. It created a power vacuum, a geopolitical opening that other players in the region immediately started to exploit. The whole deck got reshuffled. Just take a look at how the board changed. Ethiopia's hesitation created opportunities for everybody else. The US and the UK, who for years stuck to a strict one Somalia policy, suddenly started having serious talks about maybe, just maybe, recognizing Somaliland. The UAE cemented its role as the key outside power broker there. Djibouti got a wake-up call about how desperate Ethiopia was. And even Ethiopia's old rival, Eritrea, saw a chance to swoop in and gain some leverage. Ethiopia basically opened the door to a whole new regional game, and then just stood there while everyone else ran through it. So this is the really critical takeaway. The main reason this foreign policy dream turned into a nightmare wasn't because of outside pressure. No, as Gladiator Yusuf Aidan's analysis shows, the failure was overwhelmingly internal. It was rooted in Ethiopia's own problems at home. Aidan actually breaks it down into 4 key problems that create what he calls a self-neutralizing state, a state that basically trips over its own feet. The biggest piece of the pie, 40%, is institutional fragmentation. That means you've got different parts of the government all working against each other. 30% is just plain old economic weakness. 20% is a constitutional paradox where their own laws create foreign policy conflicts. And finally, 10% is something he calls epistemic decay, which is a fancy way of saying a loss of deep diplomatic knowledge and expertise inside the government. Let's just zoom in on the economic part for a second. Ethiopia's external debt is over 30% of its GDP. That means it just doesn't have the cash to compete with rivals like the UAE, who can write huge checks. You can have the grandest strategy in the world, but if your pockets are empty, it's just talk. So what's the ultimate lesson here? It's stark and it's pretty clear. The MOU didn't fall apart because of Somalia or the African Union. It collapsed under the weight of Ethiopia's own internal problems. The bottom line is, in the 21st century, a country's power on the world stage is a direct reflection of how well it's governed at home. All right, let's zoom out and look at the big picture. Because this one failed deal has ripple effects that go way beyond Ethiopia. It really signals a new chapter for the entire Horn of Africa, and it forces us to ask some really fundamental questions about what it even means to be a state in our modern world. For the last century, the old rulebook was pretty simple. You were a country if other countries said you were a country. Formal recognition was everything. But this whole episode shows a new paradigm is emerging, one where performance, actually governing effectively, providing stability, having strategic value, is starting to matter just as much, and in some cases, even more than traditional diplomacy. Somaliland is the poster child for this massive shift. And that leaves us with one final, and I think pretty provocative question. As we look at the Horn of Africa, and frankly the rest of the world, we have to ask ourselves, in an era of growing instability, does what a state actually does matter more than what other states say it is? Does performance ultimately beat the paperwork? The answer to that question could very well define the future of international relations.